Good afternoon. Welcome to the Legacies of Ukrainian Culture. My name is Harsha Ram. I'm an associate professor in the departments of Slavic languages and literatures at UC Berkeley, as well as the Department of Comparative Literature. And I want to first thank the Townsend Center for the Humanities, as well as the Institute for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures for making today's event possible. The topic of today's event is the legacies of Ukrainian culture. There is little doubt that we meet today in a time of emergency for Ukraine, for the region in which Ukraine is located, but also for the world at large. And I think I share with many of you today the sense that February the 24th of this year marked the end of an entire cycle of history that arguably began in 1991, and that we're all entering a new historical cycle whose future is very uncertain. Many of you will also have been following the news and pondering the military, the political, and the economic consequences of Russia's war on Ukraine, as well as the Western response to it. Today, however, I would like to invite you to consider another question. What is the role of culture over the long arc of history and in a present time of emergency? And more specifically, how are we to understand a culture whose language has often been suppressed, whose people have frequently been ruled by adjacent empires, and whose traditions have often been subsumed under those of their larger neighbor? Ukraine has the paradoxical status of being, at least since 1991, the largest country in Europe, but whose culture is far less known, at least outside its immediate region. To discuss Ukraine and its cultural legacies, I have invited four leading specialists in the field of Ukrainian culture and history to join us on YouTube and Zoom for the next 90 minutes. Vitaly Chernetsky, specialist in Ukrainian and Russian literatures of the contemporary period from the University of Kansas. Mayhill Fowler, specialist in Ukrainian theater at Stetson University. Alisavenko, art historian, critic, and independent curator. And finally, Stephen Siegel, specialist in the geography and cartography of Eastern and Central Europe. The structure of today's event is as follows. I will invite each speaker to share his or her work with us for 10 minutes each. At around 12:40, we will then move to a more general conversation in which I will invite them to share their thoughts on the broader trajectory of Ukrainian culture, whether over the longer arc of history, over the stretch of geography, as well as in the contemporary post-Soviet era. We also welcome your questions, which I would invite you to submit via the YouTube chat function. Let me now turn to our first speaker. The speakers will be in alphabetical order. And our very first speaker is Professor Vitaly Chernetsky, who is professor of Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Kansas. He is the author of Mapping Post-Communist Cultures, Russia and Ukraine in the Context of Globalization, published through McGill Queen's University Press in 2007. He's a native of Odessa, and completed his PhD in comparative literature and literary theory at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to coming to the University of Kansas, he taught at Columbia University and at Miami University in Ohio. His research interests include Ukrainian, Russian, and East and Central European literatures and cultures in film, theater, as well as the visual arts, the intellectual history of Russia and Ukraine, cultural aspects of globalization, postmodernism, and postmodernity. He's a past president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies and the current vice president and scholarly secretary of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the United States. He has also translated 2 novels from the Ukrainian by Yuri Andrukhovich. Vitaly, over to you.
Thank you so much, Harsha, and hello, everyone. It is a great honor to be joining you. Thank you for your interest and in your willingness to learn more about the Ukrainian culture in its richness and diversity. The tragic events, the unprovoked invasion, the reinvasion of Ukraine, because the actual invasion first began in 2014, but the new invasion has brought to the forefront the fact that the world cares about this place, but indeed does not know enough about the culture and the history of Ukraine, and that in the consciousness of many people, this country, despite what Professor Ram has just said, is that it is the largest country in Europe by territory, has remained a small presence on folks' mental maps. And this is something that we urgently need to change. And I'm heartened to see that many leading publications around the world, newspapers, monthly magazines, leading intellectual websites are rushing to bring out lists. Here are 9 Ukrainian books that are available in English translation and you can read right now. Here are 11 good Ukrainian films that you should watch right now because they're available with English subtitles. The numbers do not necessarily should be within that range, but there is definitely that kind of strong interest. And this is something that shows that we're in the middle of a fascinating process of rethinking and reconceptualization of the field of the study of the region of the former Russian Empire, Eastern Europe and Eurasia, and the fundamental need to underscore the colonialist qualities of both the Russian imperial and the Soviet project, and that the post-colonial aspirations of recent decades do not necessarily mean that things cannot be reversed. In fact, we are confronted now with a violent attempt at reversal of decolonization. And we are dealing in our field, due in part to its history of how it came into being in the United States and other Western countries, with a Russocentric prism of approaching Ukraine. Some of it comes through the influence of white Russian emigres in early years of Slavic studies in the West. Another aspect is the Moscow centrism of the field during the Cold War and the careless identification of Soviet with the Russian in much of the field, especially for the broader public, and especially with positive cultural associations. So we have to be confronting the lengthy history of absorption and uncritical reproduction of unconscious biases. Ukrainians being reduced to a bigoted colonial stereotype. In Pushkin's unfortunate formulation, plемя поющее и пляшущее, the singing and dancing tribe. We also have the problematic and pernicious legacy of association of Ukrainian only with folklore and the rural past, and anything urban, innovative, and experimental associated with the titular empires, not with Ukrainian culture. As a result, we have a classic case of the colonialists. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented prejudice. So the current war is not only afflicting physical violence on the people of Ukraine, on Ukrainian cities, on Ukrainian land, we also are dealing with the epistemic violence that is coming from the Russian government, the proclamations that actually want actively to erase Ukraine as an entity on the mental map of the world. And we need to counteract the epistemic violence that is part of this current aggression of the Russian government against Ukraine by addressing the epistemic injustice we experience in our field in regard to Ukraine. We had a wonderful provocative gesture by the late Mark von Hagen back in the mid-1990s with his famous article controversially titled, "Does Ukraine have a history?" Of course, Ukraine has a history, but the question is the question of agency, the question of subjecthood, the being at the center of the story that Ukraine is telling. As a scholar of Ukrainian literature and film, I have tried long and hard to emphasize the need to see the richness of the contributions that Ukraine has been making in those areas, and that ignoring those contributions is making us poorer. As many have powerfully argued, for instance, Taras Shevchenko, Ukraine's national poet, is one of the first theorists of formulating anti-colonial resistance and anti-colonial solidarity. His stunning 1845 poem Kafkaz, which expresses strong feelings of solidarity with the indigenous population of the Caucasus against the bloody Russian war of invasion that was taking place at the time, is anticipating anti-colonial thought of folks like Frantz Fanon more than a century later. And we also have, in the context of Ukraine, such wonderful intellectual milestones as Ivan Dzyuba's Internationalism or Russification from the 1960s, which is a Marxist critique of the Soviet nationalities policy as something that actually is a perversion of the Marxist idea of internationalism. So within the world of literature, there is now an urgent need and an urgent demand for having more work in translation, and literary translators from the Ukrainian, like yours truly, are in very high demand. In fact, today's New York Times published an interview with several of the colleagues who are working in the field of Ukrainian literary translation studies about how happy they are that there is now this strong demand, but how much work still remains to be done. And most of the Ukrainian literature books that have been published were published by small independent presses or by university presses. And this has been an example that is telling that how much Ukraine was present or not present on this larger mental map. This appears now to be changing, and I'm very glad that even under these very tragic circumstances, at least the world is paying attention. So the question might be, where do you start? One can start with anthologies. There are two wonderful anthologies of modern and contemporary Ukrainian literature that came out from Academic Studies Press, an independent academic publisher based in Boston, for whom I edit the Ukrainian Studies series. And one of them is specifically in response to the war that started in 2014. And this is the collection Words for War, New Writing for Ukraine. And another one is The White Chalk of Days, a collection that is giving a wide range of works of Ukrainian literature. I apologize, I just realized because of my blurred background, the book covers are not seen very well. Sorry, it will be difficult for me to change it in the middle of speaking. But there is a rich array of Ukrainian texts. I would encourage folks to look at the writer that Harsha mentioned in the introduction, whose work I've been translating both prose and poetry, Yuri Andrukhovich. Andrukhovich's novel, The Moscoviad, which was published in Ukrainian in '93 and in my English translation in 2008, is, in my opinion, the most powerful text about the year of 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union written in any language of the countries of the former Soviet Empire. Mm-hmm. And so it is essential for us to, when we look at Soviet culture, how it evolved and how it collapsed, that we do not by default privilege everything Russian first and treat the product of other national literatures within the Soviet realm as an afterthought. Mm-hmm. So Andrukhovich is a great example of that. Many other writers, of the women writers, Oksana Zabushko is one of the also leading critics. The more contemporary writers, one of the strongest voices from Eastern Ukraine is Serhiy Zhadan, a wonderful writer now based in Kharkiv, and his novel, The Orphanage, which is set in 2015 during the war. And that book is incredibly powerful in that it tells us how a person who strived his whole life to be apolitical, to not be part of anything, decisions about the life and the future who tried to stay out, sort of in many ways a position taken by many people in Soviet and post-Soviet space, how the events of the war force him to develop agency, force him to develop a civic consciousness. So we have a book that is both this dark odyssey through a town at war, but also a story of how a person changes through these traumatic circumstances and becomes a very new and a very different person. A similar unprecedented flowering has also been happening in Ukrainian cinema, especially in the last 8 years. And we're fortunate that many of these films are now available on streaming services with English subtitles. So even if folks go to Amazon or Netflix or the wonderful Ukrainian streaming platform Takflix, Tak is yes in Ukrainian, so the title is a pun on Netflix, you will find that there are many great works of Ukrainian cinema that are now available for you to get acquainted with. Both classics, there are a lot of wonderful films from the 1920s blossoming of silent film and from 1960s poetic cinema revival, but a great number of contemporary works as well. So we have a huge, rich cultural array. The world is waking up. It is sad that it's waking up in such tragic circumstances, but it is good that the world is waking up. Hopefully this will prevent such tragedies as the one that is unfolding in Ukraine right now from occurring again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vitaly. So many questions come to mind, but I'm going to restrain myself in order to stick to the schedule that we had arranged. And I want to now invite Mayhill Fowler. Our next speaker will be Mayhill, who is a historian and associate professor in the Department of History at Stetson University, where she also directs the program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. She holds a PhD from Princeton University and is an affiliated researcher with the Center for Urban History in Lviv and a member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in New York. Her first book, Monde on Empire's Edge, State and Stage in Soviet Ukraine, which came out in 2017, tells the story of the making of theater, both Soviet and Ukrainian, through a collective biography of young artists and officials in the 1920s and 1930s. Her next book, Comrade Actress, Soviet-Ukrainian Women on the Stage and Behind the Scenes, seeks to rethink theater in Ukraine over the long 20th century through a focus on its women. She also holds a master's degree, I should add, in acting from an MFA from the National Theatre Conservatory in 2000 and a BA in Slavic languages from Yale University. Over to you, Mayhill.
Thank you so much for this. Let me share my screen. Wonderful. So thank you so much to the organizers of this event. Thank you so much to all of you who are tuning in. And thank you so much to my co-panelists. Actually, my talk will echo a lot of the things that Vitaly Chernetsky was just saying. So I think this will work very well. I'm a scholar of theater. So this will be a talk in 3 acts. So I want to give you 3 talking points, 3 stories, because I'm a scholar who tells stories about culture in Ukraine, and specifically about theater. Now, you may think that theater is unimportant, hardly as central as geopolitics, diplomacy, or Putin. And indeed, as a historian, I've often faced a divide between theater history, what I do, and real history. But why do people dismiss theater? Theater reflects society, especially in a place like Eastern Europe, where the state and society deemed theater important because there was not a political nation or political avenue for expression. In these places, theater can help explain places. And if this weren't specifically a panel on Ukraine, I would also have to defend my focus on Ukraine. And my intellectual exhaustion at continually having had to do so leads to my overarching methodological goal in this talk. There's an agenda. Many of us who study Ukraine have been talking for years about the necessity of decolonizing the field, challenging the hierarchies that take as unquestioned Moscow or St. Petersburg as center and Ukraine as a periphery. The art historian Pyotr Piotrowski points out how certain places like Berlin or London or Paris or St. Petersburg get to be universal cities of modernism or the avant-garde. Places like Warsaw or Kyiv or Lviv are relegated to the national. Polish, communism, Polish modernism, or Ukrainian modernism. And this is actually why I like Harsha Ram's work so much on Georgian modernism, right? Can we just rethink modernism as global? And there's a connection between culture and politics. They are not unrelated. And indeed, London, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Washington, these are the cities whose stakes often seem to matter more today in Western media, more than Kiev or Warsaw, and certainly Zaporizhia, which, by the way, was also a center of modernism in the 1920s and not just the site of a nuclear power plant. So why are some places considered more important than others? And culture plays a role in reifying, but hopefully challenging, these hierarchies. This notion of Russian culture is not innocent. For example, the general public might refer to Russian theater as particularly excellent, without paying attention to the fact that much of this theater was a legacy of the Soviet Union, or artists may not have been Russian, or there was a lot of great theater in languages other than Russian or in places that are not today Russia. And cultural infrastructures in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union were deeply imbricated with the state, like they are in Russia today. And so today I find this language of Russian culture often silences other cultures. It actually erases space. And much of my work seeks to investigate precisely how space, where artists work, shapes their creativity. So in particular, let me highlight this space of what is today Ukraine. And here I take inspiration from Ariela Azoulai's work on unlearning imperialism. And the phrase I've been using in a project with some colleagues is unwinding empire, thinking about this thread of great Russian culture, of unquestioning assumptions about what is good and what matters and what should be studied, and pulling at that thread. And I think when we do so, the tapestry of culture in the region falls apart, and we're left with place. So let me give you 3 short stories that unwind empire and that tell you about the specificity of culture in this place that is today Ukraine. So we'll start with Mariazankovska, a 19th century diva of the Ukrainian stage. Yes, there was a Ukrainian stage in the 19th century. In the late 19th century, the Russian Empire prohibited the publication and performance of the Ukrainian language. With the 1863 Polish uprising, it was considered dangerous to promote Ukrainianness. To make a long story short, a group of ex-military got together and started doing professional Ukrainian language theater in the 1880s, working around these prohibitions, and they were popular. They had to write a whole repertory because of censorship, and they did. And because this region was a breadbasket and a center of serfdom, they wrote plays about the failures of emancipation. Serfdom was abolished in 1861 in the Russian Empire, and these plays were about the failures of emancipation, the struggles in the post-emancipation village. So through this theater, we actually learn a lot about the challenges of village life in this period: violence, class, property, and women generally losing out each and every time. And in fact, they performed for the Tsar. And it was on this trip that Zankovska posed for the photographer who was taking photos for Darwin's book, Expressions of Emotions in Humans and Animals. She was considered so expressive, they wanted to capture her emotions in photographs for this book. And she could have stayed in the imperial capital, but she preferred to go back to Ukraine, or the southwest region of the Russian Empire as it was. The companies she worked with there were largely Russian speaking. Their correspondence is in Russian, but they were devoted to place, to Ukrainian lands and its audiences. Their theater was specific and shaped by place. Moving forward to Les Kurbas and the Berezil. Let's skip forward and talk about the subject of my book, Les Kurbas, theater director, and his theater, the Berezil. And before February 24th, if you Googled Ukrainian theater, this is what you would come up with. In the 1920s, this was the largest state-funded theater in Soviet Ukraine in its capital, Kharkiv, and it was extraordinary. Yet it remains known largely only to Ukrainian specialists or to Ukrainians. Although Kurbas's work resembles that of famous Soviet director Vsevolod Holt, the genealogy of these techniques is different, reflecting different influences. In Kurbas's case, training with Ukrainian language, itinerant theater in the Habsburg Empire, university in Vienna, and Polish modernism. And this is my favorite show pictured here on the slides, actually not directed by him, but by his 3 proteges who came to dominate theater later in Soviet Ukraine after Kurbas's murder in 1937. This is a show called Hello from Radio 477, and it's the first ever Ukrainian musical review. It was inspired by cabaret shows in Weimar, Berlin, where they went in 27 and 28, but it was a bizarre evening that was pure Soviet Ukraine, including jokes about Moscow, jokes about the lack of products in the general store, jokes about local literary celebrities. And here you see in the photo on the left, literary figures in masks cavorting in a cafe called Hell with dancing girls. And you have another image of the dancing girls on the right. Yet the avant-garde was also multi-ethnic. And one really important feature of this place is its diversity and its multi-ethnicity. The Polish language theater in Kiev was the only one in the entire Soviet Union. Its story is important. The study of Yiddish theater tends to center around Solomon Mikhoels and his theater in Moscow, but the heartland was here in Soviet Ukraine. Jews, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians, they all made Soviet Ukrainian culture. Some directors crossed over between different theaters, some designers did, and I also think there was mutual inspiration. This is a photograph from a show called The Devils, done by the Yiddish theater in Kiev in 1929. And this line of dancing girls is so similar to that in Hello. I feel like they must have sort of resonated with each other and there must have been some sort of mutual inspiration. I keep meaning to check this in the archives, but I can't now. There's a larger argument here about the benefits of diversity. It often seems that it's the nation that inspires creativity, but in fact, creativity comes from difference, not homogeneity. This fact is actually accepted in business, but we tend to forget it in a study of the arts, which is often shaped around the category of the nation. But Ukraine actually shows us. It's a perfect example of showing the ways that diversity impacted artists to shape their creative production. Moving forward yet again, I'll skip forward to wartime 2014 to 2022. Another specificity to this place is the transformation of cultural infrastructure that was successful in the post-Soviet period. Unlike in Russia, Ukraine quite seriously cut all funding to the arts after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, long story short, people had to create new workarounds, and they did. Co-productions, grants, new ways of thinking about drawing in an audience to see your show. In 2015, MP Irina Podolyak put through a package of legislation called the Theater Laws that completely changed the structure of administering theater. For example, making 5-year positions for artistic directors instead of lifetime appointments, getting rid of the previous position of managing director, which had really been like a red director in charge of Soviet ideology, and making all appointment processes transparent. And this really succeeded in bringing a new generation into theater leadership. We saw new faces and new funding and new institutions, such as the Ukrainian Cultural Fund and the Ukrainian Institute, both of which funded new people and new projects. Decentralization politically also means decentralization culturally, and theaters began receiving much more funding from local city councils and regional councils, which allowed more relevant stories to be told, not in subtext or twisted metaphors, but directly. On my Fulbright year in 2019-2020, before COVID shut down theaters, I saw about 60 shows, and I would say over half were about the war. Of course, now all theaters are shelters. Theater people are working with refugees or sheltering from bombs. Their lives are at risk. But they will tell these stories, and in infrastructures that have nothing to do with the Soviet. Pictured here is the former Soviet Army Theater in Lviv, which is now a very cool Ukrainian language theater with an activist artistic team that got city money to renovate their building. And the sign says, "My city renovates my theater." Place matters. So these are 3 acts I've told you about today. 19th century Ukrainian language theater, creating a sense of belonging in empire. 20th century theater in Soviet Ukraine, creating experimental modernity in the Soviet space. And 21st century theater in Ukraine, solving the post-Soviet crisis of infrastructure in war with an uncertain future. And so what if we put this space and chronology at the center of our study of theater? Ukrainian theater often tends to lose out to Russian theater or Russian theater, but what if we switched our hierarchies and focused instead on place, unwinding the imperial thread and its hierarchies? I think then we might see how people come to make meaning in imperial places, how place matters for making art, and how infrastructures, invisible though they may seem, actually shape the potential for creativity. And on an activist note, this means radically rethinking the canon and rethinking the archive. What shows or artists we deem worthy of study and attention? On a more prosaic note, of course, the archive now is physically precarious. And of course, theater buildings and theater makers are fighting for their lives. What stories will be told of this war, and who will tell them? What can we do outside Ukraine to make sure that these stories are told? This is precisely what is at stake, the ability to tell stories and make meaning of this war. Thank you for your attention.
Mayhill, thank you so much for a very powerful intervention. I want to now invite Alisa Loshkina to speak. Alisa Loshkina is a PhD candidate in history at Central European University in Vienna. She's also the author of an important book entitled Permanent Revolution, Art in Ukraine, 20th Century to the Early 21st Century, that was published in Ukrainian and English by Art Has Publishing House in Kyiv, and also in French by Nouvelles Éditions Place in Paris. Alisa, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now I'll share my screen. 1 second. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to participate in this panel today. And the topic of my presentation is probably like dealing the least with the history and the most with the current events. Because I wanted to tell you the story about Ukrainian artists who are nowadays facing this brutal invasion by Russia and how they are reacting to this events. As a curator and art historian, I've always been interested in those times of turmoil and how Ukrainian art reacts to these situations. Fortunately or unfortunately, Ukrainian history is a vast field. It gives us a lot of examples of this kind. And due to my interest to this topic in general, immediately after the war started, I started gathering the information about new works of art that were dedicated to the current events. Surprisingly, there were many works, in spite of the fact that a lot of artists today are suffering a lot. You know it probably, and I don't want to repeat all those formulas, but yes, some of them are sitting in the bomb shelters. Some of them are hiding in small villages in Western Ukraine. Some of them are fleeing the country. They become refugees. They get stuck on the border. All kinds of bad things are happening to them. But in spite of this, like there is a huge initiative from European artists and huge support to Ukraine and Ukrainian culture. And due to this fact, a lot of artists have the possibility after they flee Ukraine to continue creating art. And even then, even those people who remain in the bomb shelters, due to the fact that the internet connection still works in many places, they are able to share their works online. And due to the nature of our society of spectacle, it gets viral almost immediately. So today we are in this weird situation where, for instance, I am sitting here in Los Gatos in California, and I'm watching as this events unfold in real time. So I see people being bombed, I see them fleeing from the country, and this is a very new experience. We had partially this kind of like experience in 2013 and 14, but since that time, the availability of the social media and this amount of information in the internet increased a lot, and it changed a lot the landscape. Surprisingly, artists today are not focusing that much on photography. For instance, if we are speaking about previous revolutions in Ukraine, especially the events of 2013 and 14, we would see that a lot of artists suddenly became like this photojournalists. They were just documenting the protests on the streets of Kyiv, and they were following all those events and creating this, archives of protests. But today, similarly, also surprisingly and interestingly, similarly to the situation during the World War II in Ukraine, to which all those events echo continuously, the genre of drawing and the sketch becomes one of the most relevant form of artistic expression. And most of the art that we see today in the social media are drawings. First of all, because it's a fast form of art, and second, because probably the language of photography nowadays is not able to express all this drama and all the depths of this catastrophe that Ukrainian society is facing today. So on this first slide, I'm showing an artwork by Matvey Weisberg, an artist from Jewish background, who was extremely active during the revolution of 2014 and 13, and nowadays also almost every day posts in Facebook. Facebook is still very relevant in Ukraine, and it's one of the few things that unite our artistic community, because almost everybody still uses this social network. And in the times of crisis, this positive nature of social networks can also be seen, because in spite of all the propaganda and all the fake news that we might also come across on those social media, we see a lot of solidarity and a lot of interesting things and important things, and also art. So Matvey Weisberg almost every day posts a drawing or a sketch on his Facebook page. For some reason I cannot. Same relates to Katerina Alisavenko, one of the first artists who started creating art about the current events. This image that I'm showing now is her drawings that became viral during the first days of the invasion, and we can see this classical classical Madonna style drawing, but with this fierce protest against what is happening nowadays in Ukraine. And Katerina Alisavenko now is on an artistic residence in Poland, and she escaped from Ukraine with her 2 kids and is continuously making art. She posts her drawings again and again almost every day, and she's extremely active on the social media supporting Ukraine. One second. Sorry. There is something stuck here in my... Igor Gusev, another artist from Odessa, is extremely active supporting Ukraine in these hard times. He creates a series of drawings on the covers of old books, showing us those covers are brutally torn from those books, and he's trying to show us that this old culture and all the background that we have from the 20th century today is losing its relevance because of this brutality of Russian invasion, which makes us even rethink the classical poetry of the 19th century from Russian cultures, the classical drawings from the and paintings from the 20th and 19th century, and so on. So this is this image doesn't need any comment. I think it's very clear. This other artwork is made by Nilam of Chan, an artist who works and lives in Lviv in Western Ukraine. And in normal life, he's an icon painter. And there are a lot of Christian symbols in his in the series of his drawings that he creates nowadays, reacting and reflecting on the events of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. But this particular drawing is not related to his icon painting background, because it's a reaction to one of the first cultural tragedies in Ukraine that happened in the first days of the invasion, when the museum of Maria Primachenko, a famous Ukrainian artist of the 20th century, was brutally destroyed by a Russian airstrike. And the Nilam of Chan depicts this typical creature, a beast from Maria Primachenko's artworks, which is to be honest, it's one of the most iconic symbols of Ukraine and Ukrainian art. And this beast is colored in the colors of Ukrainian flag, and it's attacking this small and weird creature, which for the artist symbolizes the current Russia and Putinist regime. Another interesting artwork is the work from an artist in Uzhgorod. You see, the geography of the artist is very wide. Like Uzhgorod is the Transcarpathian region, Lviv is western Ukraine, Kiev is the capital, Odessa is south. Probably the only artists who now don't have their voice. We cannot hear it so much because they are sitting in the bomb shelters. Mainly are the artists in Kharkiv, because the situation there is the most problematic nowadays. But other than that, people from all over Ukraine, they join in this, artistic, how to say it, campaign against Russian invasion. So this artwork, it probably needs a comment for an English-speaking audience, because the man on this drawing, he is looking at a typical cinema advertisement where it's written the agony of the USSR, which is happening now in 2022. Actually, the real collapse of the Soviet Union is happening, in spite of the fact that Russian government wants it vice versa to be the re-establishing of the Soviet Union. So another artist who is extremely active today, reflecting on the current events, is the artist whose artwork we also used on the cover of this event. It's a female artist from Lviv, and she works under a pseudo Kinder Album, and she's reflecting non-stop on the situation in Ukraine, and is again producing a drawing per day, which is extremely interesting, because in my presentation I was trying to reflect this feeling of non-stop production of imagery by putting the date of the creation of each particular artwork in the caption for the artwork. You can see that this is all very recent. This is created in response to particular events day by day, and this flexibility of a genre, of a drawing or a sketch, gives artists the possibility to make very quick and prompt responses to current events. Here you see this this idea that in Ukraine, helpless people, sometimes women, often women, are facing this brutality of a very well-equipped Russian army. And many people today say that, Ukrainians try to stop Russian tanks with bare hands. So probably this is the metaphor that the artist was using when she was creating this drawing. Another important artist, Alevtina Kahidze, she lives in Kiev, actually not in Kiev, but in the most dangerous part, because she lives in the Kievan suburbs, which today are probably the most dangerous place on earth, because they are partially occupied by the Russian forces, partially not occupied by Russian forces, but it's almost impossible to get out of there. And Alevtina, again, she's posting on social media, and you can see it almost every day how the situation changes in her life, but she is also producing almost every day a drawing which reflects on this or that particular event of political life or cultural life, or her inner contemplations about what is happening today with Ukraine. Because of course, I haven't seen, to be honest, not a single artwork in all these weeks about some general topic, or I don't know, about maybe even love or something generic. Everybody is absolutely focused on the conflict, on the drama, on the tragedy, because it's impossible to think about anything else today. So this drawing is speaking for itself. It's Alevtina's comment on the current events, on certain phrases of our now super popular President Zelensky, and her response to that quote. One of the most, like, I don't know, heartbreaking artworks in this selection, I think, is work by an artist, Yuri Bolsa, who lives in Chervonograd in Western Ukraine, and it's called Sounds of Explosions. We don't hear those explosions, but we almost hear them on this artwork, because they are there in the life of Ukrainian artists, they are there in the Ukrainian social media. It's the first time in my life when I see Facebook at war, and this is, to be honest, very strange and to a certain extent, of course, interesting, but mainly tragic side, because you can follow lives of people online. I could never imagine in my worst nightmares that I would see Ukrainian Facebook like that. I was almost anticipating it being closed and everybody leaving somewhere else, but not something like that, because you can see every day how situation changes and how people get more and more heartbroken. So Yuri Bolsa, again, it's one of those situations when one small presentation would be not enough, because he's creating a drawing per day, and there are so many of them, and they're extremely expressive. One other artist is Anton Logov, who lives in Kiev, and again makes almost a drawing per day, and this is one of his most recent drawings dedicated to evacuation of people from this place where nowadays there are one of the most severe fights in Gostomel near Kiev, and it's dedicated to this corridor for people to flee the area where the fight is so intense. And you know that those corridors are often bombed by Russian forces, and it's extremely dangerous nowadays for people, for just civilians, to evacuate from those areas. So this is made like today. And the last but not the least artwork that I wanted to show you today is a very powerful work which Anatoly Gankevich, an artist from Odessa, published today and posted, and it's just a sketch for a future painting, because Anatoly Gankevich is mainly working in painting. But this digital sketch, in my opinion, is also very powerful, because it shows us the ruins of Ukrainian cities and those people with recognizable vibe of concentration camp, who are like hiding from this truth, hiding from this information. So probably symbolizing like those Russian people who still remember the trauma of the 20th century, the Stalinist great terror, and just don't want to see the truth, because for them this is either too painful or too scary, or maybe they just prefer to live in this concentration camp, who knows. So this is where I finish my presentation. Thank you so much.
Elisa, thank you so much for sharing these urgent images of artwork from the absolute present, from the last few weeks. I want to now invite our very last speaker to join us. Stephen Siegel is Professor of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. He's the author of several books: Map Men, Transnational Lives and Deaths of Geographers in the Making of East Central Europe, of 2018, Ukraine Under Western Eyes, Harvard University Press of 2013, Mapping Europe's Borderlands, Russian Cartography in the Age of Empire of 2012. He's been a contributor to the 4th and 5th volumes of Chicago's International History of Cartography series, and has translated over 300 entries from Russian as well as Polish for the US Holocaust Memorial Museum's Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, 1933 to 1945, published by the museum as well as Indiana University Press. He's also the former director at Harvard University of the Ukrainian Research Institute's Summer Exchange Program. You can also find him active on Twitter, and he currently also hosts the author feature podcast interviews on the popular New Books Network. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Harsha. I'm so tired, and I think my pacing is going to be a little bit different, just because I feel like I've been working for 3 weeks as many of us have 16, 18-hour days as an activist publicly facing the world on Twitter, simply to multiply the number of Ukrainian voices and curate this culture and this heritage, which I love and which is being destroyed. So I don't think I can do vivace or vivacissimo. I might be able to do adagio or andante. And as an outsider, someone who is not Ukrainian, but who is a historian and who's studied this region, after I was inspired by my mentor, the late Patricia Herlihy, the historian of Odessa, I'm going to do my best to channel her spirit and to channel her voice. So I'm going to slow down, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do as a scholar and what I have been doing as an activist to raise the voices of all of those who are here and hopefully who are here in the audience today. What I've tried to do is feature the visual. And the visual, to me, to re-emphasize some of the words that have already been said, is about agency. And the agency, which I think has been absent, is an agency that has been silenced. And to quote Yevtushenko, who I also would consider part of Ukraine's heritage, Russia, the Soviet Union, the silence is screaming. The silence is screaming, in fact, in many different ways, in many different directions. It's screaming because journalists who inspired us, or at least who inspired me during the Orange Revolution by crossing the line with their great courage in 2004, face danger, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia. These journalists are, of course, many of them women. They should be highlighted and featured. I'm trying very hard to avoid policy and yet at the same time to make sure that I'm not simply romanticizing the archive. I agree wholeheartedly about the necessity for space and place and geography. I think mental maps, if we can talk about them, are mental maps which are transnational, to use a kind of overused word, not simply Ukraine-centric or Russo-centric or nation-centric, not defensive either, because many of us, I think, are reacting to Russia's chauvinism, imperialism, colonialism, great powerness. What I want to do for the rest of this talk, very simply, is try and offer a rejoinder and a response to violence and murder and war crimes and the criminal destruction of culture. This culture is, of course, Christian, Muslim, it is Jewish. I watched with great horror the desecration of Babi Yar. I watched with pride on February 24th as the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, for which I worked for 6 years, came out with one of the very first statements of solidarity in defense of Ukraine against Putin and against this war of aggression. One of my very first projects which I ever worked on was a book at Harvard called Ukraine Under Western Eyes. And I want to tell you a very short story about the family, which is really not well known. This is a family of journalists and activists, the Kravtsev family. And they donated this collection, which became the largest collection of maps of Ukraine, some 900, actually 891, to Harvard in 2004, 2005. It was a gift. They were very fearful, having seen the Orange Revolution, that the state might not last and that it might be destroyed. And they donated this giant collection, which I've made available for free, going back to the Renaissance, covering all of the different empires, Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, Soviet maps, Ukrainian maps, bilingual, trilingual maps. All of these maps I wrote about, and I labored at this for 6 years in my book, which I called Ukraine Under Western Eyes, based on their collection. I remember distinctly traveling from Cambridge to New Jersey and speaking with Bogdan and Neonila, well, Neonila because Bogdan had died. And Neonila Kravtsev entrusted me with the story and asked me very emotionally to make sure that I got it right. I think all of us, if I can use a collective royal we, and maybe this works and maybe this doesn't, are curators and activists. We work on cultural fronts. We understand as artists or critics or cultural workers the nature of intimacy and distance, or sometimes, as geographers put it, proximity. And there is a great proximity at this moment to the multicultural and multilingual and multi-confessional heritage of Ukraine, which absolutely must be emphasized at every turn against the bogus claims, ridiculous, absurd claims that the Kremlin is making to a one-way interpretation of Russian history. The maps are in Yiddish, in French, in German, in Armenian. These are all maps which I would consider part of a heritage that needs to be preserved. I want to emphasize Mayhill's point and Alyssa's point and Vitaly's point that we are modernists. And this anti-modern gesture, perhaps even anti-urban reactionary gesture, does not harmonize with the kind of histories we have been working on for the greater part of our careers. One example of this is the surrealist cartographer, since I'm a carto historian, the Ukrainian-born Boris Artsipashev, who worked for the US State Department and for Time magazine, really great talent, graphic designer. I spent a lot of the last 2 or 3 years in public fora dealing with prejudice. And I think maps, if I can talk about them as artifacts and icons, are markers of prejudice, race, class, gender, orientation, phobias, philias, and so on. I want to know where penguins live. I want to know how to map the voiceless, the peoples who are stateless, as many Ukrainians now have become. How do they preserve their homeland, and how do we help them preserve their homeland? I look at this, which I posted in December of 2018, with trepidation, really with dread. These are men from a panoptical standpoint, controlling, partitioning, pointing, gesturing, carving with borders and lines. And for those of us who study borders and lines, take, for example, the partition of India in 1947, we know that the drawing of borders happens with violence, and it often happens arbitrarily outside of the frameworks of international law. Why do we study cartography as part of a heritage of any nation or state? I think it's very easy in many respects to speak of the nationalization of territory. One of the first historical atlases that was made was an atlas of Finland in 1899. But of course, if we're dealing with this, we have to talk about graphic design and control and the centers of every map. This is the posterist Boris Berezovsky, a self-taught artist born in Omsk, a map that's found in the Russian State Library in Moscow. I want to say a few words about the viral map phenomenon, which I wrote about and actually spoke about as an activist in Berlin after the annexation of Crimea in March of 2014. I am not really able to watch a whole lot of Russian television or Russian propaganda without getting nauseous as a historian of cartography because of the screens and because of the designs. The maps that appear on Russian television quite often are the maps that appear on CNN quite often, in which a person uses a finger to point to the map in a gerrymandered universe in order to crack or pack or redraw. The belief that territories are manipulable is not simply part of Russia and Russian culture, it's part of our postmodern understanding of geopolitics. The maps, in addition, which split Ukraine into ethnic territories, not surprisingly came from the 2001 census. So I know we had mentioned Mark von Hagen's classic essay, 1995, Does Ukraine Have a History? We have largely been trapped in the universe of invented, imagined nations, communities, Benedict Anderson Census Map Museum for way too long, understanding or perhaps misunderstanding that Ukrainian identity could be strong and civic. And this emphasis on the strength of Ukrainian civic values perhaps is not a mappable phenomenon, at least not in that Herman Melville Moby Dick kind of way. Values are hard to define, and values have to be articulated beyond the language of conflict and crisis. What the Russian state has attacked, and in fact, the Russian government continues to attack in its denialism, is the very essence of these civic values, aiming through violence, missiles, bombs to destroy museums, like, for example, the Ivankiv Museum north of Kiev or the Kharkiv Opera House, and to replace culture with the power of masters to redraw. I emphasize this heritage because heritage is immediate, up to the moment. The past in the present is also the present in the past. And it's full of tropes and myths. Sometimes those myths may be true. Ukraine, the land of the Cossacks. I emphasize the importance not simply of reducing populations to colors and blobs, but also studying regions and the people of those regions within their agency. Because after all, it's they who are making choices to stay or to leave. And it's they who are making choices on what government they want to form, which is, I think, what is, at least to me, one of the most offensive things that I've faced in the last 3 weeks in trying to raise voices. There's no question that boundaries are fluid, and this is a good example from perhaps the most famous geographer and cartographer whom I write about in my books, Stepan Rudnitsky, a speaker of German, Polish, French, English, Russian, and Ukrainian. Rudnitsky, making these maps, was an advocate for Ukrainian independence after World War I, an independent government. And he drew a broader, greater Ukraine in pink, like in the style of the British Empire, if you've studied their late 19th century maps, encompassing the Kuban. But of course, it should be emphasized that these Ukrainian intellectuals, scientists, geographers are in large part now the targets of the missile attacks. It's their institutes, their universities, their schools, this professional class, which was purged once before, and it should be said, could be purged again. I can offer plenty of examples. I've curated, cataloged exhaustively, probably 8,000 or so tweets. I don't know how many European academics and other academics or professionals, interested ordinary people, have followed what I've been doing, but you can, of course, scroll down my feed and see what things I've done since I joined Twitter in 2018. This is one of my very favorite maps, and I'll kind of, wind down with this one, because I think this idea of Ukraine as a multi-ethnic land, graphically depicted, territorially sovereign, with icons in multiple languages, here German, here Ukrainian, is something that Russians, maybe from Moscow and St. Petersburg, intentionally or unintentionally forget. And when that forgetting is deliberate, I think it's our responsibility as intellectuals to call it out, to study it, to decolonize the field, as Mayhill says. And I will push it one step further, because I've been saying it for some time, to assign culpability. I learned this as a German historian. I learned this as someone who is Jewish. I think it's incredibly important to stand within the universal as well as within the national and within the intellectual communities to which we belong. So there are many examples of this I can offer. I would just simply urge you to collect the visuals as Alisa has done, I think really, Alisa, courageously, in the hardest of times, to give voice, agency against these threats of erasure and silence and partition. It's these scientists, geographers, historians of the earth that I want to return to, not perhaps with a grain of salt, but with whatever remains of the Ukrainian land. This is, and this was, the Ukrainian land in Kharkiv, where I taught, where we taught, Mayhill and I, in the summer of 2019. It is where our friends, professors, hid in bomb shelters and basements praying the Torah at night. And many of them have left it behind. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you so much. I also want to invite the audience at this point to share any questions they may have through the chat in YouTube. As we now shift to the remaining 20 minutes of our conversation, I first want to simply acknowledge the range of interventions that you've made, and also the tone that underlay those interventions, the ethical urgency, the fierce anger, the immense sadness, but the deep engagement that all four of you have made in your respective fields, and what you've been willing and able to share with us today. It's very difficult to step back from the urgency of the now, and I don't think we should. But I'm also wanting to pick up some threads, perhaps common threads that unite all of your interventions that we might want to begin reflecting upon in the time that we have left. I'm struck by the consistent engagement all of you have had with the question of empire and decolonization, and the idea that on some level, empire is inescapably connected to both physical violence and erasure, but also what Vitaly called epistemic or cultural violence as well, both of which are being enacted as we speak. And one of the questions that I think, ideas that seem to sort of consistently be present throughout your interventions was the idea of somehow unraveling, unwinding those imperial legacies, right? And I'm struck by two questions that come, and we can take this in one of two directions. On the one hand, I think it's important to remember that there were actually multiple imperial formations, right? Poland, Lithuania Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Soviet Union, and this post-Soviet monstrosity of the Putinist state. So there's a multiplicity of empires, and that would be one question to think about, these multiple imperial legacies. But I'm also interested, perhaps because I don't want to lose sight of the other aspect of the question, which is what happens when we unravel those empires, right? And I'm struck by the fact that none of you necessarily said that there is some kind of primordial Ukrainian essence that needs to be preserved in its purity or in its wholeness, but rather something that I think Stephen called agency, that Mayhill called place, right? That others of you have called land. And I'm interested in also inviting you to think more about what happens when we peel away those layers. Is it simply the question of peeling away the onion? And what do we find when we get there? And I'm sure there are going to be very many different answers depending on the particular angle of vision that you have. But I want to invite any comments or thoughts that you might have, both on the imperial legacy and on what might remain and how to think about that remainder in rich and complex ways. Feel free to just jump in, I think, at this point. And we
All right, I'll try.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Harsha, for these comments, which definitely help us think through things. And I agree that we should not be looking for some sort of ineffable essence that is stripped through, that is revealed through stripping the layers of various imperial interventions. However, we do, and we can look at continuity of concern practices over time, and there is a continuity of certain traditions of engagement and dialogue, traditions of that multiplicity. The fact that many observers of Ukrainian culture and history have described that Ukraine is fundamentally not a top-down society. The joke, when there are two Ukrainians, there are three hetmans, and the often invoked reference that Ukraine is where anarchism was born and where there was the only attempt in history to create an anarchist state, shows something about tendencies in Ukrainian culture and social organization, but also the catastrophe of Russian invasion has also created this tangible evidence of incredible social mobilization, where the very diverse groups, the groups that often were criticizing each other, were fighting with each other just weeks ago, all of that has fallen to the wayside. The incredible consolidation and mobilization of society. And this is something that the pundits, both Western and especially in Putin's circle in Russia, completely missed. The fact that this is a society that takes its strength from its diversity, that people of all walks of life, of very different backgrounds, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and otherwise, are united in their courageous fight to defend this idea, the Ukrainian idea that is being crystallized and conceptualized with greater clarity now than perhaps ever before in history, even though we do have this kind of continuity. And this is the value of freedom and dignity, and not to flatter American audiences too much, but it makes you think back, for instance, to Ukrainian and Russian interpretations of Slavophilism in the 19th century, where in Russian case we had Pushkin, Slaviansky ручьи сольются в русском море, ноль иссякнет воль вопрос. So Russia dominates everything, while the Ukrainian vision of a free confederacy that the Syro-Methodian Brotherhood was advocating. And if we're quoting national poets, Shevchenko's famous «Чи діждемося Вашингтона з новим і праведним законом». So in the middle of the 19th century, Ukrainian poet is calling for a Washington of our own with a new and righteous set of laws. So the image of a nation of laws and a nation of ideas, as opposed to a top-down authoritarian state, is something that has been present quite consistently across a lot of Ukrainian history and in its cultural conceptualization.
So a sense of civic nationalism that is increasingly consolidating, as well as an older tradition of non-hierarchical sense of community would be something that you would situate as a consistent feature of something like a Ukrainian tradition.
Yes.
Other observations?
Sure. So first of all, I loved what Vitaly just said. So yes, but also I think this question of multiple empires and multiple influences, I find really important. And I've become increasingly interested in lives. And in my current project on actresses, the first time I presented it, I got a comment from someone who said, well, why are you working on actresses in Ukraine? Like, why aren't you just writing about like Soviet actresses? And in having to kind of, again, defend Ukraine, I was able to come up with an answer, which was there's a way that experiences shape lives. So someone may have grown up in the Habsburg Empire, say, and then moved to Soviet Ukraine. But their life is shaped by World War I, by occupation, by certain ways that Stalinism unfolded in Soviet Ukraine, by certain experiences in World War II that were specific to this region, right, versus other regions. And so there's ways that experiences shape lives. And so I'm sort of thinking about the ways that individual lives defy scholarly categories, and that we define things in terms of a political polity, or even a regional polity, but that lives move back and forth. And how do we create scholarly categories that actually capture a human life? That's something I'm increasingly interested in. And I think that there's another question that Vitaly expressed so well, which is that when we talk about Ukrainian culture, it's happening right now. I mean, literally this moment of, 3 weeks ago, people were fighting about Zelensky, or, the latest theater thing, right, from UKF, the Ukrainian Cultural Fund, and now everyone's come together. And I think that this experience of war is creating Ukrainian identity right now, right? And that the experience of people going through this incredible experience and this trauma is shaping this place. And I would add too that it's not only that experience of mobilization and coming together, but it is trauma. And I think that's something that studying this place really tells us. I mean, yes, the empires and other peoples in this space as well, but that this place in particular tells us about the way that trauma shapes people, and the way that trauma shapes society and trauma shapes culture. And I think what I'd noticed so much in the theater in the last couple of years was dealing with the trauma of war through theater. And I think we're going to be seeing that so much when Ukraine is free again.
Stephen.
So I want to answer the question directly about imperiologia, because I remember getting started with this as a graduate student in 1999 in a previous century. And I remember the moment of excitement reading the journals Kritika and Ab Imperio when they first were founded, when they first started, and thinking, this is so wonderful. This is really what I want to do. I want to research it, write about it. I think I have a couple of books in me. Let me go forward. But to answer your question more directly about primordialism and essentialism, I think it was through reading cultural anthropology and reading literary critics and scholars like you, Harsha, and like you, Vitaly, in trying to understand the nature of post-colonialism and subaltern studies and bringing that into a larger framework. It was that move as an intervention and as a strategic thing that got me to write about the Ukrainian past in a certain way. And let me just use my next minute to give one example. So I think one of the most important things we can emphasize, #ScienceForUkraine, supported by ACES and BASES and AWSS and ATSIL and hopefully ACTR and other associations, AAUS, ASN. Science for Ukraine is a defense of Ukrainian independent intellectual life. Mm-hmm. This was a life which began among the National Awakeners, Greek Catholic clergy before 1848, if we study the trajectories of nation building. It was a history and a legacy which happened between empires, not just within a state or within nation states, between, on both sides of the Zbruch River. Mm-hmm. And, to emphasize this point, I wish Serhiy Plokhy was here, but the seminal moment, after all, was the establishment in 1894, Mihailo Hrushevsky teaching research as a scholar, really the first professor, the first historian in Ukrainian history and Ukrainian studies. And it really, if we start from that moment in 1848, when the Department of Ruthenian Language and Literature was formed in Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg, Leopol, Leopolis, I think there's an inspiration that we can take going back to those moments before World War I, in fact, before any of these world wars, to see the importance of preserving that legacy. It's a legacy with which or for which Ukrainians speaking Ukrainian, in addition to sometimes German, Polish, Russian, French, and other languages, really built what became the first marker of an independent identity, both ethnic and civic, and probably one should say much more. What breaks my heart in seeing the missiles fall, in addition to other things, the human catastrophe, women, children, others being killed, is the destruction of that intellectual life. Mm-hmm. I could not sleep for days after I saw the Karazin University in Kharkiv destroyed. And the attacks on the universities is, I think, repugnant. There's really no word for something like that. So study that past, read your hundreds of pages of Yakelchik and Magochi and Plokhy and the others. I think we can refer you to here, those of you who are here in the audience, in order to get that history of empire beyond primordialism and essentialism straight.
Thank you. Alisa, I want you to also have a chance to share your thoughts.
Thank you. I think that today it's very important for us to stress the unity of Ukrainian culture, because when I was writing my book about Ukrainian art of the 20th and 21st century, it was like my biggest task to piece together this scrap quilt of different cultures, of different sometimes traditions, different states, different, absolutely situations. And initially I was even skeptical myself. I was thinking, okay, maybe I'm a little overreacting. Maybe I'm just doing some artificial, putting some artificial bridges and everything. But in the end of the day, after I wrote the book, I became the biggest believer in Ukrainian culture and in the consistency of this culture. And there are bridges, and a lot of traumas happened and a lot of disasters happened in Ukraine, especially in the 20th century. It was one of the most difficult, I think, centuries for our history. But through all this time, we see a lot of artists are being repressed. They are executed and killed and put to concentration camps. But then there will be one single person remaining, and this single person creates this tiny, tiny thread. And it's almost unbelievable how this gives fruit like 20 years after that, and in a different part of the country, and it still becomes relevant to people. It's like our poet, national poet Taras Shevchenko. I grew up thinking that this is just like some bronze statue from my schoolyard, who is just like, it was horrible for me because we were brainwashed at school, you know, Shevchenko, because he is at the same time a means of Soviet propaganda, post-Soviet propaganda. So everybody is trying to use Taras Shevchenko. Even now, there will be an immersive exhibition of Taras Shevchenko, like Van Gogh's in the United States. So it's like, it's his karma to be like that. So, but when our society faces challenges such as like revolutions, wars, you suddenly, I don't know how it happens, suddenly all those things, it's like in the DNA, and it starts like growing, and you suddenly open your eyes and think, oh my God, this guy is absolutely relevant, and he's absolutely cool, and we should read them. And I'm crying while reading him, and I have his, you don't see it here, but his portrait on my wall. So this is just unbelievable how those things are like, sometimes they lose relevance, sometimes they resurrect. And I think that today we have to speak more and more that no, there are no two Ukraines, as Russian propaganda wants us to believe. And there is no such things as like Nazism in Ukraine, which they want the world to believe. Because the absurd and the paradox of this war is that they are trying, Russians are trying to denazify Eastern Russian-speaking parts of the country, which used to be the most pro-Russian regions ever. So, and today their identity is changing, and Mayhill is absolutely right, because this Ukrainianness and this idea that no, we are not like our former president Leonid Kuchma once, Orange Revolution stood against him, but he wrote a book which was called Ukraine is Not Russia. And I don't know, their book is junk, but the title is very, very correct. And probably today it's one of the key ideas of Ukrainian national identity. We probably don't have so much even, I don't know, to share or in common, and or we still didn't formulate other than this, and also this urge for freedom. Like Ukraine now is the symbol, like Russia is an oppressive society. Ukraine is always showing that, no, we don't want, we would go to Maidan, we would fight, we would create revolutions. Yes, we would sleep sometimes, and we would allow people and other countries to dominate us or something. But in the end of the day, Ukraine has this, talent to protest and to revolt. And that's, I think, what Putin hates about us, because this is this faceless KGB style horrible state, which is facing a community of individuals. They might have a lot of problems and misunderstandings between each other, but they are individuals and they hate it about us.
So what I'm in a sense sensing from all of you is a complex legacy that's slowly congealing into a kind of national civic identity, very often, as happens in other parts of the world, under intense pressure, under the pressure of empire, under the pressure of physical violence and war, but also an older legacy that is one not simply of some kind of primordial essence, but also of critique, right? Taras Shevchenko's poem from 1845, Kafkas, which suggests that he not only understands the oppressed nature of his own people, but is able to recognize and express solidarity towards the other peoples, subject peoples of the Russian Empire. And I want to really, in that context, invite other people watching and listening, particularly those who are perhaps even faculty members, teachers, instructors, to consider decolonizing your syllabus by also including Ukrainian texts, Ukrainian artworks, Ukrainian culture, and to think about the Russian Empire alongside the other empires of the world as having important lessons to teach us about how to be, how to resist, how to be free, and how to dream and imagine a future, and one that, in fact, all of us on this planet have to ultimately share and figure out together. We have very little time, but I know that, Stephen, you want to say something in addition, so I want to give you a chance. No? I think we have 1 more minute. So if anyone wants to just add one final word, I would welcome it.
I would just say thank you so much, Harsha, again, for reaching out to us and for bringing us together. This is what those of us who are in the field of Ukrainian studies and who've been working on this for years within different parts of it are incredibly grateful that in these trying times, we see solidarity and support from our peers, our colleagues, and we see a transformation of the field that is happening. So I was talking about an appeal to do that, what we actually already see that appeal happening. In all the sort of different aspects of it, a colleague has written to me asking if I'm aware of projects to de-imperialize and decolonize Russian as a foreign language instruction in the United States, for example. So it is not only in literature, history, culture, but even in those kind of seemingly practical and pragmatic things, but also, of course, hugely culturally and ideologically invested, like foreign language instruction, that we see transformation happening there.
Thank you so much, Vitaly. We've run out of time. I just want to say, actually, to those of you who are local, that the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at UC Berkeley hopes to begin teaching Ukrainian as of this fall. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Mayhill Fowler, Alisa Loshkina, Vitaly Chernetsky, and Stephen Siegel. And we very much look forward to continuing this conversation at some point in the future. Thank you so much.